Good morning folks, and welcome back to the channel. I'm Pinat Reports, and I report on the unreported. Now today, I'm in Lancaster to tell you the story of Lancaster's most brutal and horrific murder. It's a historic case that went down in history due to the forensic techniques that were used to solve this crime. And it's absolutely incredible. So today, join me as we explore this story. Buck Ruxton, born Buktiar Chompa Rustomji Rutanji Hakim, was born in Bombay in India. He was born into a wealthy middle-class Parsi family of Indian and French origin. Ruxton received a respectable upbringing, and despite being a sensitive youth with very few friends, he was highly intelligent and he received an excellent education. Shortly after completing his studies, Ruxton obtained employment at a Bombay hospital where he specialised in medicine, midwifery and gynecology. In 1926, Ruxton relocated to Britain. He attended medical courses at London's University College Hospital under the name Gabriel Hakim, before moving to Edinburgh in 1927 to begin studies towards obtaining a fellowship of the Royal College of Surgeons. Shortly thereafter, he legally changed his name by deed poll to Buck Ruxton. Now, while studying in Edinburgh, Ruxton actually became acquainted with a 26-year-old woman, and her name was Isabella, and she managed a cafe in the city of Edinburgh. The two of them, they began dating, and when Ruxton moved to London in 1928, Isabella, she came with him. The following year, Isabella gave birth to the couple's first child, and it was a daughter, and her name was Elizabeth. In 1930, the Ruxtons relocated from London to Lancaster, here in Lancashire, where he established a medical practice at his family home here at number 2 Dalton Square. Now, Ruxton, he had made great efforts to assimilate himself into British society, and he quickly acquired a reputation among his patients as a compassionate doctor who was well respected and popular within this local community. He was also known to have waived treatment fees on several occasions when he felt patients just couldn't pay for medical procedures. Bearing in mind, this is a time when no NHS was available, so Buxton, he let them off. So the following year, here, a second daughter was born. Her name was Diane. 2 years later, in 1933, Isabella gave birth to a son, and his name was William. So now, here, they living in a great life. They had 3 children together, and life was going good for the Buxtons. The Ruxtons employed a young maid and live-in housekeeper, and her name was Mary Jane Rogerson. Primarily just to care for the children, now that they had 3 children, and a busy doctor's surgery over here at number 2 Dalton Square. So despite Buck Ruxton's esteemed reputation within Lancaster community, the relationship between Buck and Isabella Ruxton was fraught, and he became increasingly suspicious, always very suspicious of Isabella, his wife, and alleged infidelity. And it was reported that he always exploded into fits of rage or tearful hysteria and self-pity behind closed doors. On several occasions, these arguments would prompt Isabella to pack her belongings and return to Edinburgh with her children, although inevitable phone calls from Ruxton in which he would tearfully plead with Isabella to return to Lancaster, to this house here, to this mad surgery. So he was super suspicious of her, building up stories in his own head about Isabella, about her infidelity. So on the evening of the 14th of September 1935, Isabella Ruxton left this family home to go to Blackpool to see the illuminations and to visit 2 of her sisters who both lived near Blackpool. She left Blackpool to return home here at approximately 11:30 at night. Upon her return to Dalton Square, this house, in the early hours of Sunday, the 15th of September, Ruxton's jealousy and paranoia apparently overwhelmed him, and he was most likely strangled Isabella into submissiveness, unconsciousness, or death with his bare hands before beating and stabbing her body. So either to prevent, this is the sad thing here, to prevent their housemaid from discovering his crime, or because she'd actually witnessed the act of Ruxton murdering his wife, he bludgeoned and strangled Mary Jane Rogerson, the live-in housemaid. He apparently also stabbed her body before or after death. Now, the amount of blood subsequently discovered on the stairs, on the walls and on the carpets of this house indicates excessive blood flow prior to the body's mutilation, leading to the conclusion that Ruxton had either stabbed either or both victims extensively in this house. Buck Ruxton drove his children to the home of a Morecambe dentist, who he and Isabella formed Then the package was human. Officers then searched the entire stream and the surrounding ravine and the nearby River Annan, which is down this direction, upon where they discovered 2 human heads and 4 further bundles, each containing extensively mutilated human remains, including a thigh bone, legs, flesh and a human torso. Of the 4 bundles recovered during the initial search, the first was wrapped in a blouse, and it contained 2 upper arms and 4 pieces of flesh. Now the second bundle, to be found right here, comprised of 2 thigh bones, 2 legs, from which most of the flesh had been stripped, and 9 pieces of individual flesh, all wrapped in a pillowcase. And the third was a piece of cotton sheeting, and it contained 17 individual pieces of flesh. And the fourth and final package that was found here, dumped by Buck Ruxton, was also wrapped in cotton sheeting, and it consisted of a human trunk and 2 legs with the feet tied with a hem of cotton sheet. Absolutely insane, and that was all found here. Other packages were opened to reveal the 2 heads. One of the heads was wrapped in child rompers. A quantity of cotton wool and sections from the Daily Herald newspaper, with 2 forearms and hands attached, but minus the top joints of the fingers and thumbs, and several pieces of skin and flesh. One part was wrapped in the Sunday Graphic, which was dated the 15th of September. And that's the Sunday Graphic newspaper. On October the 1st, the remains were examined at Moffat mortuary by the forensic scientist John Glaister Jr. He determined that the 70 separate sections of human remains thus far discovered in this ravine were those of 2 females. Notably, the 2 females were different heights, and they knew this. And also the mutilation conducted upon the remains had been committed by an individual with extensive anatomical knowledge in an obvious effort to complicate the identification of the remains. So Buck Ruxton went to extreme measures to hide his tracks, mutilating these poor ladies so much just to hide his tracks. In addition to the extensive mutilation across both victims, it was found that it had been entirely committed with a surgical knife, as opposed to either a saw or an axe. The murderer had removed the eyes, the ears, the lips, and several teeth from both heads to make identification via dental records or composite drawings impossible. So guys, we're just leaving the area where Buck Ruxton drove on that fateful night, and it's up by those trees. That's where the ravine is at. And that's where he discarded the bodies of Isabella and Mary Jane Rogerson. But when he done that, he got back into his car and proceeded to drive back home to England, to Lancaster, going through Kendal. Buck Ruxton, after discarding the mutilated remains of both Isabella and Mary Jane Rogerson in the ravine up at Moffat in Scotland, he drove back to Lancaster, driving through Kendal. Whilst driving through Kendal, he actually hit a cyclist off his bike But he didn't stop. And he just kept driving on his journey back to Lancaster. The cyclist, being a smart guy, quickly and cleverly noted his car registration. He wrote it down from a pocketbook within his pocket, and he reported the incident to the police. After hitting the cyclist up in Kendal, Buck Ruxton proceeded to head back to Lancaster using the back roads. And using those back roads, he came along Milnthorpe. Now, Milnthorpe is where the police managed to intercept Ruxton's car, and they questioned him about the incident with the cyclist back in Kendal. Being the persuasive and master manipulator that he was, he somehow explained this all away. However, his location had now been officially logged by the police. So they knew he was here, and they knew he was in Kendal. But why? A further bundle containing human remains was discovered shortly after the two bodies had been transported to the University of Edinburgh. One of these bundles contained two human forearms with the hands attached. The fingerprints had not been completely obliterated, just like the other ones where he cut the ends of the fingers off. As such, investigators were able to obtain a complete set of fingerprints from the remains. Forensics were able to determine that one of the bodies was that of a woman aged about 30 to 55, and that of the second body was aged between 18 and 25. Both fitting in with Isabella and Mary Jane Rogerson age. It was further concluded that the mutilation of the two bodies would have taken approximately 8 hours to complete. 8 hours. And that the two bodies had been drained of blood, like fully drained of blood at the time of their dismemberment. Absolutely insane. So it took Buck Ruxton 8 hours in his house back over that side at Dalton Square. 8 hours. Gee. Several of the pages of the Sunday Graphic, which the remains had been wrapped in. So the Sunday Graphic newspaper. This was a souvenir edition of that newspaper, which had been printed and circulated solely in the Morecambe and Lancaster area of England on the 15th of September. Strongly suggesting the two victims and or the murderer lived in the northwest of England. Furthermore, sections of the clothing in which the dismembered remains had been found were also distinctive, with unique factors such as a repair patches beneath one of the arms on the blouse, and knots that a special kind of knot that was used to tie the child's rompers that one of the body parts was wrapped in. So 5 days before the discovery of the human remains in Moffat in Scotland, Ruxton had actually visited Lancaster police, claiming his wife had once again deserted him. He had earlier visited the Morecambe household of the parents of Mary Jane Rogerson, claiming that their daughter had recently engaged in an affair with a local youth, and that she'd actually become pregnant. And that's bringing in the kind of unwed moral defective of the time, because it's a no-no at the time. So what he said was Isabella, his wife, took her away to Edinburgh to discreetly take care of it, basically have an abortion. Now, abortions at this time were illegal. But Ruxton, he urged the Rogersons not to call the police, knowing that they were illegal and they probably would listen to him and not do it. So on October the 9th, Scottish police visited the Rogersons' household, so Mary Jane's parents' house in Morecambe, and asked Mary Jane's parents if they were able to identify any sections of clothing in which the bodies had been wrapped in. Mrs. Rogerson immediately recognised the distinct patchwork beneath one of the arms on the blouse, saying it belonged to her daughter, who they'd last seen on Saturday the 14th of September. Mrs. Rogerson was unable to identify the pair of child's rompers, the one with the knot that was shown to her, but suggested that the police should show the garment to a friend of hers named Edith Home, who lived in Grange over Sands, which is like the back end of Morecambe over the water. Apparently Isabella, Mary Jane Rogerson and the children had briefly stayed over there on a vacation. So when Mrs. Holmes saw the rompers, she immediately recognised them as a pair she had bought one of the Ruxton children the previous summer. The Chief Constable of Dumfriesshire discovered that Mary Jane's employer, Buck Ruxton, had informally reported his wife missing the previous month, and that the final confirmed sightings of Isabella alive by anyone other than Ruxton himself had been on the evening of the 14th of September, when she had left her two sisters in Blackpool to return to her Lancaster home, which is just over the back over there on Dalton Square, number 2. The same day that the police identified several items of the clothing used to wrap the dismembered remains, Ruxton again visited the Lancaster police station, and that was based here in the old town hall on the ground floor. On this occasion, he burst into tears, complaining that local rumours around Lancaster had begun to circulate regarding the discoveries of the human remains in Scotland as being those of his wife and the maid. And these rumours were proven to be detrimental to both his medical practice and his general reputation. He requested that the Lancaster police, he requested that they conduct discreet inquiries to locate his wife and maid before demanding that the police search his house to quash these rumours. And so the police went over there at the other side of that statue to number 2 Dalton Square, and they searched. On the evening of the 12th of October, Ruxton was arrested by Lancaster police and extensively questioned throughout the night. When asked to account for his whereabouts between the 14th and the 29th of September, Ruxton then produced a handwritten document entitled My Movements, which he then passed to investigators before making a voluntary statement based on what he had written. Now, in this interview, Ruxton denied that he'd ever been to Scotland, but we know different. However, he was unable to explain just why his car registration number had been logged by a young cyclist who he knocked over in Kendal. And remember, we've just been to Kendal, we know that. 17th of September, which led to his vehicle being intercepted at Milnthorpe, and we've just been there, and that was the same day. So these key points has made him a liar. Because the cyclist reported his registration number and he logged it in his pocketbook. So he gave it to the police when Buck Ruxton failed to stop at the scene of the accident. Buck Ruxton was then further unable to explain just why a police search of his home the previous day had revealed extensive traces of bloodstains on the stairs, railings and various carpets within the property, despite evidence of the house being extensively cleaned and several walls in there had been redecorated. He went full all out, but he was also unable to explain why traces of human fat and body tissue had been discovered within the drains of the property, with much of the material recovered within the sections of the drains leading from the bathroom. So Ruxton was formally charged with the murder of Mary Jane Rogerson at 7:20 a.m. in the morning, following an appearance in custody of the Borough of Lancaster Police Court, situated on the ground floor of Lancaster Town Hall behind me. Ruxton was remanded in custody. So on the 5th of November, he was further charged with the murder of his wife, whose remains were positively identified using the technique of forensic anthropology, in which an X-ray of the victim's skull was superimposed on the photograph taken of Isabella Ruxton when she was alive. Now, this was the first time ever anything like this had ever been done. It was unprecedented, the technique which they used, and this paved the way for modern forensics and identification of murder victims who could not be identified. On the 2nd of March in 1936, the trial of Buck Ruxton opened at Manchester's High Court of Justice. He was tried for the murder of Isabella Ruxton, and on this date chose to enter a formal plea of not guilty to the charge of murder. Following this formal plea, a jury was brought in and sworn to duty. Now, the prosecution at Ruxton's trial contended that Ruxton, inflamed by jealousy and paranoia, had murdered Isabella Ruxton and Mary Jane Rogerson in the family household over at Dalton Square, and that he had then discarded their bodies more than 100 miles from Lancaster in the Gardenholme Linn up at Moffat in Scotland. In his opening speech to the jury, Joseph Jackson stated, "It does not need much imagination to suggest what probably happened in that very house. It is very probable that Mary Jane Rogerson was a witness to the murder of Mrs. Ruxton, and that is why she met her death. You will hear that Mrs. Ruxton had received before her death violent blows in the face and that she was strangled. The suggestion of the prosecution is that her death and that of the girl Mary Jane Rogerson took place outside these rooms on the landing at the top of the staircase at the home at 2 Dalton Square. They came to this conclusion because there was actually heavy blood trails, enormous quantities of blood leading from the door to the bathroom. So that suggested that was the area where it initially happened. He also said, I suggest that when she went to bed, a violent quarrel took place, that he strangled his wife, and that Mary Jane Rogerson caught him in the act and had to die also. Now, Mary's skull was fractured. She had some clear blows to the top of the head, which would render her unconscious, thankfully. And then she was killed by some other means, probably a knife. So then the defence testimony time. And for the defence, the only sole witness to the defence was Buck Ruxton himself. Ruxton completely conducted himself poorly on the stand, and he was prone to bouts of hysterical sobbing as he clutched a silk handkerchief and hysterically claimed that he had last seen his wife when she had taken Mary Jane Rogerson to Edinburgh to discreetly arrange this abortion, this phantom abortion. So the trial of Buck Ruxton, it lasted 11 days. Following the closing arguments and final instructions, the jury retired to consider their verdict. They would just deliberate for literally over 1 hour before returning a verdict of guilty against Buck Ruxton and sentenced him to death. When asked by Judge Singleton if he had anything to say in response to the verdict that has just been passed, Ruxton responded stating, "I'm very sorry," before politely thanking the court for its patience and fairness of his trial. Ruxton then informed the judge of his intentions to appeal the verdict. Ruxton did file an appeal against his conviction of murder and guilty. This appeal was heard at the Court of Criminal Appeal. The appeal was dismissed the very same day. And it's funny because the strange thing is, loads of Lancaster residents put in a petition, signed a petition urging clemency for Ruxton. It actually amassed 10,000 signatures, but it was ignored, and he was hanged at Manchester on the morning of the 12th of May 1936, and his executioner was Albert Pierpoint. So the day after the Ruxton's execution, a Sunday newspaper published a brief handwritten confession written by Buck Ruxton on the day after his arrest. This letter, which had been instructed only to be opened in the event of his execution, and if he didn't get executed, it should be returned to him. If he got acquitted, return the note. But he got executed, so the note got published in the newspaper. And it was his confession. And in this confession, Ruxton admitted to killing his wife while in a state of jealous fury, only to be interrupted in the act by Mary Jane Rogerson, resulting, he stated, he had to also kill her. So after the deaths of their parents, and as you know, they had 3 children, Elizabeth, Diane and William Ruxton. Well, it's believed that they actually got sent to an orphanage in the Wirral area. So there you have it, guys. the incredible true story of the real Jigsaw Murders that happened here in Lancaster. So guys, closing thoughts. This to me shows, yes, Buck Ruxton was a callous murderer who was overtaken with jealousy and rage. But prior to all of this, he was a nice man. He helped many people. So many Lancaster folks with medical issues, helping those who couldn't afford to pay their medical bills. They needed medical help and he still gave it. Buck Ruxton cannot be forgiven for his actions, but I don't think he should be forgotten as the compassionate man he obviously was. This is a sad tale where one man's jealousy engulfed his mind, engulfed his life, sadly resulting in 3 people losing their lives, one including him, and 3 children becoming orphans. Thank you very much, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this wonderful journey from Lancaster to Moffat in Scotland to Kendal and Milnthorpe and back to Lancaster. The complete story of Buck Ruxton, the real savage surgeon. I'd like to thank you all for tuning in. I really do appreciate it. It means the absolute world to me. So until next time, folks, thank you very much. You all take care and all the best.